You know how in bow hunting we often talk about needing more power, heavier draw weights, faster bows?
Mm.
Well, what if I told you a 54-pound longbow, yes, a relatively light one, shooting a specifically designed arrow actually punched through tougher targets than arrows carrying way more kinetic energy from high-tech compound bows? Kind of makes you stop and think, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, and it immediately tells us that there's more to the story of arrow penetration than just brute force. Welcome, everyone, to this deep dive where we unravel some pretty fascinating findings.
Exactly. Today we're getting into the nitty-gritty of Dr. Ed Ashby's 2007 study update, Part 4 Extreme FOC, Penetration Enhancing a 54 4-tag longbow. Now, this isn't just someone's opinion. It's a really detailed look,
Mm.
a very meticulous analysis, actually,
Super detailed.
at how different arrow setups performed when shot from that 54-pound longbow. And it includes some surprising comparisons to bows with much heavier draws. Dr. Ashby and his team, well, they really left no stone unturned in testing various arrow parts and
And the brilliance of this study, I think, for every bow hunter listening, whether you're just picking up a bow or you've been hunting for decades, is how it pinpoints the key things that make an arrow penetrate effectively.
Right.
Our goal in this deep dive is to extract the most important lessons from this research, showing you how making smart choices about your arrow setup, even seemingly small ones, can have a huge impact on your success in the field. This is practical stuff you can really use.
Okay, so to really get a handle on what helps an arrow dig deep, Dr. Ashby first needed a standard, right? Something to compare everything else to.
Exactly. A baseline.
This was the baseline arrow setup for that 54-pound longbow. Think of it like establishing a control in an experiment.
Precisely. The idea was to see how a typical, well-tuned arrow for a bow of this power would perform. That way, we can then clearly see the improvements gained by adding specific features designed to boost penetration.
So what was this baseline arrow like? Picture this. A traditional parallel cedar shaft, good old wood, but with a tip reinforced with purple heart, which is a really dense hardwood. It was just over a 132 of an inch wide and topped with a 123 grain Zwicky Eskimo broadhead. That's a classic double bevel design with a sharp tanto tip. The whole arrow weighed in at 520.7 grains.
Okay.
And the FOC, the front of center balance, was 10.3%. Pretty standard.
Right, right. And those numbers resulted in an impact momentum of 0.351 slug foot-tech and an impact kinetic energy of 26.71 foot-pounds when it hit the target at 20 yards. One other thing to note is that the wooden shaft was actually a hair smaller in diameter than the metal part of the broadhead, the ferrule.
Oh, interesting. To reduce friction, I guess.
Yeah, that's generally thought to reduce friction as the area goes in.
Now, the choice of that Zwicky Eskimo head for the baseline is interesting too. Dr. Ashby points out that it's known for having a pretty good mechanical advantage compared to many other common broadheads, especially like the multi-blade ones.
Right.
He even mentions that another head that is standard technically has a slightly higher MA, but the Eskimo was chosen because it had shown better results on really thick bone in other tests they had done previously.
Exactly. This wasn't just a random pick from a catalog. The baseline arrow was meant to represent a pretty good setup for a 54-pound longbow, a quality shaft, a respected broadhead, flying straight. It's what you might consider a solid, middle-of-the-road option that experienced traditional bow hunters might use.
Okay, so how did this solid middle-of-the-road arrow actually perform when they put it to the test? They shot it into the back of the shoulder of buffalo at 20 yards. These were big, mature bulls.
Tough test.
Yeah. And out of 5 good shots, not a single one even poked through the first rib bone. The average penetration was only about 5 3/4 inches. The arrows themselves didn't break or bend, though, which is something.
And as Dr. Ashby explains, this level of performance against a tough, like half-inch thick rib bone isn't really surprising when you consider the relatively low impact force and the fact that the arrow's weight, that 520 grains, was below what he calls the heavy bone threshold.
Right, we'll probably talk more about that threshold later.
We will. But this really drives home the point that even a well-built common arrow will hit its limits pretty quick when it slams into significant bone. It's something for you to keep in mind depending on the size and bone structure of the game you're after.
Okay, so we've got our starting point, 5.75 inches, no rib penetration. Now comes the part where things get really interesting. Seeing what happens when they started tweaking the arrow design to enhance penetration.
Yeah, let's see the improvements.
The first thing they looked at was using arrows with a normal front of center balance, still at 10.3%, but with different broadheads. This leads us to test set 1.
That's right. These arrows used a heavier 189 grain Pro Big Game broadhead. This one had a 25-degree double bevel cutting edge and a COI tento tip, just like the modified Eskimo in the baseline setup, but, bigger and heavier.
Okay, so heavier head. The total weight of the arrow jumped up quite a bit to 723 grains, but that front of center balance stayed the same at 10.3%.
Right, they kept the balance point consistent for this comparison.
And that extra weight definitely showed up in the impact numbers. Now we're looking at an impact momentum of 0.421 slug-foot-sec and a kinetic energy of 27.55 foot-pounds. So a noticeable increase in that pushing power, the momentum, although the kinetic energy was only a little bit higher than the baseline, not a huge jump in KE.
And the results on the Buffalo were also noticeably better. These arrows managed to punch through the entrance rib 100% of the time on the shots where the arrow stayed in one piece.
Big difference there.
Huge. And they averaged 9.16 inches of penetration. However, some of the arrows did end up with cracked shafts on the shots that didn't fully penetrate as deep. So durability became a bit of an issue.
Okay, so we're seeing almost a 60% increase in average penetration compared to that baseline arrow, and they're now consistently getting through that first rib. Dr. Ashby credits this improvement to the greater momentum of the heavier arrow and the better mechanical advantage of that Pro Big Game broadhead compared to the Eskimo. He even points out that the jump in penetration was bigger percentage-wise than the increase in kinetic energy or even momentum alone, which suggests that how efficiently you use your force is really key.
Exactly. It highlights that it's not just about how much energy your arrow has, but how effectively that energy is focused and used to slice through tissue and, importantly, bone. Efficiency matters.
Next up, test set 2. This time, they used a 190-grain Grizzly broadhead. This head was very similar in size and shape to the Pro Big Game, but with one very important difference.
The bevel.
Yeah, it had a 25-degree single-bevel cutting edge, also with that COI Tanto tip. The total arrow weight was almost the same at 724 grains, and the front of center balance remained at 10.3%. So again, very similar impact momentum and kinetic energy to test set 1. Basically swapping double bevel for single bevel.
Right, a really clean comparison. But the results were even more impressive. The arrows that remained structurally sound in this group averaged 10.5 inches of penetration.
Another jump.
Another significant step up, yeah. A 23.3% increase over the Double Bevel Pro Big Game in test set 1. And Dr. Ashby makes it crystal clear that this extra penetration can be attributed solely to the advantage of that single bevel broadhead design.
This really starts to show the difference that something as subtle, maybe, as the bevel on your broadhead can make. And the study actually goes into this in more detail with what they call a single bevel versus double bevel deep dive.
Yes, and what's so compelling is how consistently that single bevel advantage showed up. Across all their tests, different broadheads, different bows, different impact speeds, single bevel broadheads consistently demonstrated an edge when it came to getting through bone.
How so? What was the mechanism?
Well, this led to them hitting bone more often and, on average, going deeper overall. The reason for this, as the study explains it, is that single bevel broadheads seem to need less force to break through bone, instead of just trying to push straight through like a wedge. The angled edge helps to create a twisting motion that can split the bone, conserving energy for deeper penetration. Think of it like using a rotating chisel versus trying to hammer a flathead screwdriver through wood.
Okay, that makes sense. The twisting helps it kind of pry its way through.
Exactly. And it's important to understand that while broadheads with a lower mechanical advantage, maybe wider heads might see a bigger percentage jump in penetration when you switch them to a single bevel. Broadheads that already have a high mechanical advantage, like narrow or longer ones, tend to still penetrate really thick bone better overall, regardless of whether they're single or double bevel. The single bevel just adds another layer of efficiency to that already good design.
This brings us to the idea of mechanical advantage itself, which might be a term some listeners aren't as familiar with. We hear a lot about how sharp a broadhead is, but this MA seems to be another really critical factor that maybe doesn't get talked about enough.
Absolutely. In simple terms, mechanical advantage, or MA, is how effectively the broadhead can use the force of the arrow to cut. It's related to the angle of the blade generally. Longer, narrower heads have higher MA.
Okay.
And Dr. Ashby presents data from testing done with a heavier 82-pound longbow using single-blade, double-bevel broadheads with arrows weighing between 650 and 900 grains, shot into the side of buffalo chests. This data clearly shows a trend. As the mechanical advantage of the broadhead goes up, so does the average depth of penetration. pretty linear.
More MA, more penetration. Makes sense. And this data also helps clear up a common misunderstanding about what they called the heavy bone threshold. It's not like there's a magic arrow weight where suddenly everything breaks when you hit it, is it?
No, not at all. It's more of a point, roughly around 650 grains in Ashby's test, where the frequency or likelihood of getting through really tough bone increases significantly for all types of broadheads.
No.
However, how much that likelihood increases depends a lot on the broadhead's mechanical advantage.
So a higher MA head gets a bigger boost in its chances once you cross that weight threshold.
That's a really important point to understand, yes. Above that threshold, broadheads with a high MA really shine. The data from Asian buffalo showed that they achieved a 100% success rate in penetrating ribs on shots to the chest at reasonable angles, as long as the arrow weight was sufficient, above that 650 grain mark.
Wow, 100%. But it's not just about that cutting edge MA, right? The study mentions other things.
Correct. The study also points out that other parts of the broadhead design are crucial, like how smoothly the metal ferrule tapers down to the blade, and just the overall structural strength of the whole head. You want edges catching or the head bending.
Yeah.
They even mentioned the Howard Hill broadhead as an example. It has a high MA blade, which is good, but the ferrule design isn't ideal and can sometimes cause it to get hung up in bone, reducing penetration despite the good blade geometry.
So the whole package has to work together.
Precisely. Every part of the system needs to work together. A really sharp, high MA blade is great, but if the ferrule creates too much friction as it goes in, or if the head isn't strong enough to handle hitting bone, you're not going to get the best possible penetration. It'll fail somewhere.
Now, what happens when you take those efficient single-bevel broadheads and combine them specifically with these high mechanical advantage designs? The study has some really interesting data on that comparison, too.
It does. When you look at all the data they collected specifically for broadheads that had a high mechanical advantage defined as MA of 2.6 or higher in this context, the single-bevel version showed a really significant jump in average penetration compared to their double-bevel counterparts.
How significant?
Almost 33% on average, based on the mean, and nearly 45% based on the median, which maybe gives a better idea of the typical increase you might see, less skewed by outliers.
That's a massive difference. Almost half, again, as much penetration just from the bevel type on an already efficient head.
It's huge. Dr. Ashby explains that an increase like that could easily be the difference between just getting one lung and hitting both lungs on a big animal like an elk, or maybe even getting a complete pass-through on a deer where you might not have otherwise with the double bevel.
It really emphasizes the power of that single bevel in either needing less force to initially break through the bone, or perhaps in widening the hole it creates as it rotates, which then reduces friction on the arrow shaft as it continues to penetrate.
Exactly. Less resistance, deeper travel.
And speaking of that arrow shaft and reducing friction, this is where the rotation of the arrow itself comes into play. Especially when you're using those single bevel broadheads, this seems important.
This is a critical detail that a lot of hunters might overlook or not think about. To get the maximum benefit from a single bevel broadhead, the spin you put on your arrow with your fletching needs to match the direction of the bevel.
Okay, so explain that.
So if you're using a right-hand single bevel broadhead, like that grizzly they tested, you need to use right-wing fletching or a right helical. If you use left-wing fletching with a right-hand bevel,
They fight each other.
yeah, they work against each other. The fletching tries to spin it one way, the head tries to rotate the other way as it hits resistance. You can actually lose penetration potential, even ending up with less penetration than you would with a comparable double bevel broadhead. You negate the benefit.
Wow. Okay, so match your fletch to your bevel.
Yeah.
Crucial. And there was another tip in there, too.
Yes, it's also a good piece of advice, especially with screw-in heads. Make sure those broadhead adapters are really tight. Maybe even use a little bit of thread locker, like blue Loctite, something non-permanent to keep them from loosening up due to that rotational force during flight or impact.
Right, you don't want the head wobbling or coming unscrewed.
Absolutely not. It's all about minimizing anything that could reduce your arrow's effectiveness or cause a failure. Every little bit of wasted energy or increased resistance can be the difference between a clean kill and a lost animal.
Okay, so we looked at how normal FOC arrows performed and how different broadhead designs, especially MA and bevel type, affected penetration. Now we get to the real focus of this part of Dr. Ashby's research. Testing arrows with an extreme front-of-center balance. This is test set 3.
Right, the main event for this paper. This test used the exact same 190-grain Grizzly single-double broadhead as test set 2, a proven performer, and the total weight of the arrow was also kept virtually identical at 724 grains.
Okay, same head, same weight. What changed?
The big difference here was how that weight was distributed along the shaft. By adding significant weight to the front of the arrow, heavier inserts, maybe point weight modules, the front of center balance was pushed way up to 25.7%.
Whoa, 25.7. That's way higher than the 10.3% in the other sets.
Exactly. But importantly, the impact momentum and kinetic energy figures remained almost exactly the same as in test set 2, because the total weight and the bow's launch speed were essentially unchanged.
So the only real changes were where the weight was concentrated along the arrow, and maybe a tiny difference in the overall length of the shaft needed to achieve that extreme FOC while keeping the spine correct.
Precisely. A very clean comparison focusing just on the effect of FOC. And the results, well, they were nothing short of dramatic.
We lied on us.
When they shot these extreme FOC arrows into the back of the shoulder of those buffalo, the average penetration jumped to a whopping 14.625 inches.
14.5 inches from 10.5 in the last test.
Yep, and get this. They even had some shots where they intentionally hit the scapula, the shoulder blade, which is a really tough bone. In one case, the arrow was stopped by the scapula, but another one nearly passed completely through it.
Through a buffalo scapula with a 54-pound bow.
With a 54-pound longbow. It's pretty incredible. That's a massive 154% average penetration increase over the baseline common arrows we started with.
Right, the 5.75-inch ones.
And a remarkable 71.4% increase over the matching normal FOC single-bevel arrows in test set 2. All this with practically the same amount of force at impact. It clearly demonstrates the incredible effect that extreme FOC can have on penetration.
It's almost hard to believe it's just the balance point doing that.
Well, Dr. Ashby even highlights the fact that the worst-performing extreme FOC arrow in this set still penetrated as much as the best-performing normal FOC arrow from set 2. That's a huge gain in consistency, eliminating those shallower hits.
That's maybe even more impressive. It makes the whole system more reliable. It really makes you reconsider where you're putting the weight in your arrow, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
And the study suggests that extreme FOC doesn't just work on its own. It actually seems to make other penetration-enhancing features even more effective, like a synergy effect.
Exactly. For example, those single-bevel broadheads showed an even bigger percentage increase in penetration when they were used with extreme FOC arrows compared to when they were used with normal FOC arrows. The single-bevel advantage was amplified. And the same positive effect was seen with other features designed to improve penetration. This strongly supports the idea that what really drives penetration isn't just the total kinetic energy, but something called the impulse of force.
Impulse of force. Explain that a bit more.
It takes into account both the momentum of the arrow and the amount of time that force is applied during impact. Think of it like a longer, more sustained push rather than just a quick punch. Extreme FOC seems to help maintain that forward push for longer during the penetration event.
Okay, so it resists slowing down better.
That seems to be the idea. And to really back this up, the study looks at the combined results from 5 different sets of tests they focused on, totaling 92 comparable shots, where they compared matched normal high FOC and extreme FOC arrows.
And what did that bigger data set show?
Across all of these tests, even in some cases where the extreme FOC arrows were actually a little bit lighter overall due to shaft differences or whatever, they consistently showed noticeable increases in penetration. The conclusion they draw is that extreme FOC helps the arrow maintain its force as it's going through the target, likely because it reduces how much the arrow shaft bends or flexes upon impact, and maybe reduces overall shaft drag against the wound channel.
Ah, the noodle versus stiff rod analogy comes to mind.
Exactly. Imagine trying to push a cooked spaghetti noodle versus a stiff metal rod through something resistant. The stiff rod, representing the EFOC arrow-resisting flex, is going to go much further with the same amount of initial push because it doesn't waste energy buckling.
Okay, that makes intuitive sense. So to put a number on it, for bows in that mid-50-pound draw weight range, just having that extreme FOC, when you've already got other good penetration-maximizing features like a good single-bevel head and perfect arrow flight, resulted in about a, what was the percentage again?
Around a 40% increase in penetration compared to arrows with a more standard front-of-center balance, even when those standard FOC arrows were otherwise identical.
40% just from FOC, that's huge.
And that's considered the minimum expected gain when comparing apples-to-apples optimized arrows. When you compare those really optimized extreme FOC arrows to typical off-the-shelf or common arrows that don't have these other enhancing features, like maybe a lower MA head, double bevel, standard FOC.
Right, like the baseline arrow.
Exactly. The difference in penetration on really tough bone impacts can be as much as 2.5 times. It's potentially a real game changer in terms of arrow performance, especially against bone.
It's also really interesting to think about what this means for people who shoot bows with lower draw weights. Maybe youth hunters, women, or just guys who prefer lighter bows.
Right. The study suggests that they might actually see the biggest percentage improvement from switching to extreme FOC arrows.
Yeah.
It allows them to potentially get penetration performance that's similar to what you'd expect from someone shooting a much heavier draw weight, maybe 20 or 30 pounds heavier, but using a more traditional, normal FOC arrow setup.
So it levels the playing field somewhat.
Yeah, it really seems to. However, Dr. Ashby does offer some very important words of caution here. It's not magic.
Okay, what are the caveats?
He stresses, and this is crucial, that you absolutely must have perfect arrow flight to see these benefits. Just slapping a bunch of heavy components on the front of your arrow isn't going to magically make it penetrate better if it's hitting the target sideways or wobbling all over the place. Tuning is paramount.
Gotcha. Perfect flight or forget it.
Pretty much. And extreme FOC by itself isn't a miracle cure either. It won't make up for an arrow that's just too light overall in terms of mass, lacking momentum, or if you're using a poorly designed broadhead when you slam at a really dense bone like a leg bone.
Yep.
It helps, but it won't overcome fundamental physics.
So it boosts penetration after you breach the bone, or helps you breach lighter bone, but doesn't guarantee you'll bust through anything.
Exactly. But once you get past that initial bone impact, or if you hit softer tissue or lighter bone-like ribs, it can significantly boost how far your arrow goes, even if you're shooting a lighter draw weight. It really is a package deal, as Ashby calls it. All these factors, FOC, mass, broadhead MA, single bevel, structural integrity, perfect flight working together.
Think about the real-world implications for you as a hunter, though. Those extra few inches of penetration that EFOC seems to provide on a shot into the chest of a big, thick-bodied animal like an elk or a moose, that could absolutely be the difference between hitting both lungs and just getting one, or getting a non-lethal muscle wound.
Absolutely. Or think about a quartering away shot on a deer. That extra penetration might be what allows your arrow to reach those vital organs deep in the chest cavity instead of stopping short in the paunch or liver.
That potential doubling of penetration we talked about, when you compare a fully optimized EFOC setup to a common baseline arrow, that is truly significant in practical hunting terms. Makes you look at your current arrows, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Now, the study also touches briefly on something a lot of hunters debate. What's the best broadhead for a gut shot? There's a common belief that multi-blade broadheads are better for causing more internal bleeding in soft tissues like the intestines because they cut a wider hole initially.
Yeah, you hear that argument a lot. More cutting surface.
And Dr. Ashby presents some counter-arguments for why single-bevel broadheads might actually be advantageous even in those unfortunate situations. He talks about how their twisting action can create what he calls starburst cuts in the elastic tissue of the intestines, potentially causing more significant internal damage than a straight slice.
Interesting theory.
He also points out that the rotation of a single bevel head naturally creates a longer primary cut pathway as it twists its way through. But really, the study emphasizes the most critical factor if you do happen to make a gut shot, regardless of the type of broadhead you're using. Patience. You absolutely have to be patient and let the animal bed down without being pushed or disturbed. Giving it plenty of time hours, often overnight if conditions allow, before you attempt to track it, significantly increases your chances of a successful recovery. Don't rush it.
Good advice regardless of the head type. Bleeding from a gut shot is generally slower.
Exactly. Patience is absolutely key in those tough situations.
The study also briefly mentions that the performance they saw with those extreme FOC arrows in their testing, as good as it was, could potentially have been even better.
Yeah, they note that Set 3 didn't incorporate every possible penetration enhancer. They could have potentially boosted performance even more by using a broadhead with an even higher mechanical advantage, like a modified version of that grizzly with a steeper angle, maybe adding a slippery Teflon coating to the broadhead, and potentially using an arrow shaft that tapers towards the front, which can also reduce friction.
So there's always room for more optimization, it seems.
It really shows how many small details can add up to influence that final outcome. And then there's the absolutely crucial topic of how strong the arrow itself is. The study delves into this quite deeply, looking at structural failure.
Yes, they really looked at whether it's a structural failure of the arrow bending, breaking component damage that causes it to stop penetrating, or if it's the other way around where the resistance stops the arrow and then it breaks.
And the evidence from their tests strongly suggests that a problem with the arrow's integrity, a structural failure, is what initiates the failure to penetrate, especially on hard impacts.
How did they determine that?
They found a perfect 100% correlation in their buffalo rib impact data between an arrow breaking, bending, or having a problem with its components like a bent broadhead or a damaged insert, and that arrow failing to penetrate the rib even when those arrows were heavy enough above the heavy bone threshold to typically break through bone without issue.
Wow, 100% correlation.
Yeah. Even arrows made of hardwood or doubled shafts, which are very tough, if they suffered any structural failure on impact with the rib, they failed to penetrate it. Whereas arrows that stayed intact, even lighter ones sometimes, would penetrate.
That really highlights that even if your arrow has enough force, enough momentum behind it, if it's not structurally sound enough to withstand the impact, it's just not going to perform reliably. The strength of the entire arrow system from the tip of the broadhead to the nock is absolutely paramount.
Paramount. And the tests they did with that 54-pound bow provide clear examples of this. Every single time an arrow that was heavy enough to be above that heavy bone threshold suffered some kind of structural damage during the back of the shoulder impacts, its penetration stopped right there. The bone might have been damaged, cracked, or broken, but the arrow's progress halted because the arrow itself failed.
It's interesting that the study also looked at how often the arrow shafts themselves were damaged when using different types of broadhead bevels with that 54-pound bow. Was there a difference?
There was. They found that both the normal FOC and extreme FOC setups using the single-bevel grizzly broadheads resulted in fewer damaged shafts compared to when they used the double-bevel pro big game broadheads, even though the impact forces were similar.
So the single bevel was easier on the arrow, too.
It seems so. And this trend holds true when you look at their broader data set covering many more shots with standard carbon arrow shafts as well. Non-internally footed carbon shafts tipped with single-bevel broadheads showed a significantly lower rate of damage when hitting heavy bone compared to those tipped with double bevels.
Why would that be?
It suggests that single bevels encounter less of that initial peak resistance when they hit bone. Because they're starting to rotate and split immediately, maybe the shock loading on the shaft isn't quite as abrupt or intense as the pure wedge effect of a double bevel trying to force its way through.
That makes sense when you think about it, that splitting action puts less direct, blunt stress on the whole arrow system. And this leads us nicely to the idea of internally footed shafts, or IF shafts, which the study mentions.
Right. The study emphasizes that internally footed shafts, where you have a metal sleeve inside the shaft behind the insert to reinforce it, represent a significant advancement in making carbon arrows more durable, especially when they hit really hard bone. They might even be as tough, Ashby suggests, as the best traditional hardwood shafts in terms of resisting failure right behind the broadhead.
And did they test this?
Well, initial testing they referenced, done with that heavier 82-pound bow, showed almost no damage at all to IF shafts when they were paired with single-bevel broadheads and strong steel or brass components like inserts and adapters. The failure point was essentially eliminated.
It sounds like those IF shafts could be a real game changer for carbon arrow reliability, especially for hunters who are pushing the limits with heavy, high FOC setups for big game.
It really could be. And it's exciting to hear that commercially produced IF shafts were, at the time of the study, being developed, hopefully making that technology more accessible to everyday bow hunters. More durable arrows mean more consistent penetration and fewer lost or broken arrows, which is a win-win.
Okay. Now we get to the part that I know a lot of listeners, especially those who shoot lighter draw weights, will be particularly interested in. How do these super-tuned, penetration-enhanced arrows from that 54-pound longbow actually compare head-to-head with the kinds of arrows that are typically used with much heavier bows?
Yes, this is where the study really starts to challenge some of the conventional wisdom in bow hunting. By comparing shots on buffalo that only hit ribs to standardize the resistance, and where the arrows stayed structurally intact, they were able to directly compare the penetration performance against 70-pound and 82-pound longbows using what they considered commonly used or typical arrow setups for those bows. And all comparison arrows were tuned for perfect flight.
Okay, fair comparison. First up, let's look at how that 54-pound bow with its normal FOC penetration-enhanced arrows, remember, sets 1 and 2 with the pro big game and grizzly heads stacked up against the 70-pound bow using common arrows. What did they find?
Well, first, as you'd expect, the average penetration achieved by those common arrows from the 70-pound bow. And they looked at both arrows with a variety of single-blade broadheads, and those specifically using that same 190-grain grizzly was much, much better than the 54-pound bow's baseline arrow. The extra draw weight clearly helped the common arrows.
Okay, no surprise there. But what about compared to the 54-pounder's enhanced normal FOC arrows?
Here's where it gets interesting. The average penetration they got from the 54-pound bow's normal FOC, penetration-enhanced arrows, sets 1 and 2 combined, was virtually identical to the penetration they got from the 70-pound bow's common arrows.
Wait, really? So the 54-pounder with good arrows matched the 70-pounder with average arrows?
Pretty much, yeah. Even with a 16-pound difference in draw weight, carefully optimizing the arrows for the lighter bow using heavier weight, higher MA, Single-Bevel effectively closed that performance gap against typical setups from the heavier bow, at least on these rib impacts.
That's pretty remarkable. It really shows that how you design and build your arrow can make a huge difference, maybe even more than just adding draw weight if the arrow isn't optimized.
Exactly. It underscores the importance of the arrow itself. And when you then compare the 54-pound bow using those extreme FOC penetration-enhanced arrows, set 3, to those same common arrows from the 70-pound bow, the difference becomes even more significant.
How much better did the EFOC arrows do?
The 54-pound bow with the extreme FOC setup showed a substantial increase in penetration over the 70-pounder's common arrows, over 63% better than the 70-pound bow's all-single blades group, and nearly 40% better than the 70-pound bow's arrows that were also using that same 190-grain grizzly broadhead, but with normal FOC.
Okay, so adding that extreme front of center balance gave a much bigger boost in penetration performance than just having those extra 16 pounds of draw weight in the heavier bow shooting common arrows.
A much bigger boost, yes. The FOC effect outweighed the draw weight difference in this comparison.
What about when they compared it to an even heavier bow, the 82-pound longbow using commonly used arrows?
The trend continues, maybe even more dramatically. The 54-pound bow shooting its optimized extreme FOC arrows still outperformed the 82-pound bow's common arrows by a considerable margin.
How much?
Almost 49% better penetration than the 82-pounder's all-single blades group, and still a solid 17% better even when compared directly to the 82-pound bow's arrows that were using that same 190-grain grizzly broadhead, but again with normal FOC.
So the 54-pound bow with the fully tricked-out EFOC arrow was out-penetrating average arrows from a bow nearly 30 pounds heavier.
On these specific tests, yes. These comparisons really drive home the point about the power of optimizing your arrow setup, especially when you include that extreme front-of-center balance. It strongly suggests that a bow in the mid-50-pound range, when paired with the right arrow components and tuning, can perform just as well as, or even significantly better than, bows with substantially higher draw weights that are using more conventional, non-optimized arrow designs.
It really makes you wonder, as Ashby poses, could a bow with an even lighter draw weight, say around 30 pounds, when shooting a fully optimized extreme FOC arrow above the heavy bone threshold, potentially match the penetration performance of a 60-pound bow using a common arrow?
It's a fascinating question. The study does acknowledge that there's likely a minimum amount of force needed to initially break through bone, regardless of the arrow setup. You probably can't go infinitely low in draw weight, but the possibilities for hunters who physically need or simply prefer lighter draw weights are certainly intriguing based on these findings. More study is needed there, of course.
Now, let's circle back to that really surprising finding we mentioned right at the very beginning. That 54-pound longbow actually out-penetrating high kinetic energy arrows shot from much faster compound bows.
Yes, this is a really key takeaway from the entire study, and it fundamentally challenges the pervasive idea in modern archery that kinetic energy is the primary or even the only thing that matters when you're talking about how well an arrow will penetrate.
So describe the high KE group again.
The arrows in that high kinetic energy group, which were shot from compound bows and other parts of Ashby's overall study, were typically lighter arrows traveling at much higher speeds. They had significantly more kinetic energy, averaging almost 83 foot-pounds, and also more momentum, 0.556 slug-fit-sec, compared to the extreme FOC arrows from that 54-pound longbow, which had only about 28 foot-pounds KE and 0.421 momentum.
We're talking about nearly 3 times the kinetic energy for those compound arrows compared to the longbow arrows. That's a massive difference on paper. And
yet, those penetration-enhanced extreme FOC arrows from the relatively slow 54-pound longbow actually out-penetrated the high kinetic energy group by nearly 20% on average.
Yeah.
And by a remarkable 35% when you look at the median result, which isn't skewed by potential outliers.
Out-penetrated them by 20 to 35%, despite having only a third of the KE.
Correct. And what's perhaps even more telling is the difference in actually getting through bone. The high KE group had a significant failure rate, about 31% when it came to penetrating those buffalo rib bones, compared to the 100% success rate on rib penetration for the 54-pound Bow's optimized EFOC arrows in that specific test set.
That just blows my mind. It really hammers home the point that just looking at kinetic energy on a chart doesn't tell you the whole story about penetration, not even close.
Not even close.
Yeah.
The weight of the arrow, contributing to momentum and FOC potential, the structural integrity, the design of the broadhead, MA, and bevel, and that extreme front-of-center balance. These factors clearly have a much bigger impact on how well an arrow will actually penetrate animal tissue and bone than just how fast it's going and how much kinetic energy it carries at launch.
And it's a bit concerning, or at least thought-provoking, when you think about how kinetic energy is often used in hunting regulations in some states or countries to determine if a certain setup is legal for different types of game.
It is. Those high KE arrows in the study, the ones that fail to penetrate ribs 30% of the time, would often be considered perfectly legal, even recommended, for large game animals like elk or moose, based solely on their KE number.
While the incredibly effective deep penetrating arrow from the 54-pound bow, with its lower KD, might actually fall below the recommended minimums for even smaller animals like deer in some charts or regulations, it's kind of backward, isn't it?
It does seem backward when you look at actual terminal performance data like this. It really makes you wonder if the archery industries and maybe hunters' focus on speed, primarily for flatter trajectories and longer shooting distances, has perhaps overshadowed the fundamental importance of achieving clean, ethical kills through sufficient penetration, especially when bone is encountered.
Yeah. Hopefully, studies like this will help encourage a shift in how we think about arrow performance, moving away from relying solely on that single kinetic energy number as the ultimate metric.
We can hope. Now, despite the truly impressive penetration performance of that 54-pound bow when shooting its optimized arrows, the study makes a really important point about whether this setup is truly adequate for hunting very large and potentially dangerous game like Asian buffalo.
This is a crucial point to emphasize, right? We don't want people thinking a 54-tag longbow is the ideal buffalo setup now.
Absolutely crucial. Let's be perfectly clear. These results do not mean that a 54-pound bow, even with these fantastic arrows, is an ideal or even necessarily ethical choice for hunting buffalo. And frankly, neither are those 70 or 82-pound bows if they're just using common arrows that don't penetrate adequately either.
So what defines adequate for something like buffalo?
The standard for a truly adequate setup for an animal that large, tough, and potentially dangerous is being able to reliably achieve a complete pass-through, or at least traverse the entire thorax, on reasonably well-placed shots into the chest. You need an exit wound or close to it.
And the 54-pound setup didn't do that.
No. The 54-pound bow setup they tested, while it showed impressive penetration depth compared to others, mostly resulted in single lung hits on those buffaloes. It wasn't consistently getting through to the far side. And a single lung hit on an animal like that can lead to very long tracking jobs and potentially dangerous follow-up situations, which is simply not acceptable from an ethical or safety standpoint.
So good penetration, but not enough penetration for that specific animal.
Exactly. Now, Dr. Ashby does speculate that it might be possible to achieve a more reliably adequate outcome on buffalo with even further optimization of that 54-pound setup, perhaps using a broadhead with an even higher mechanical advantage, adding a slippery coating, increasing the arrow mass even further while maintaining EOC, and using a tapered shaft.
Pushing every single advantage.
Right. He even mentions some promising anecdotal results from another hunter, Cheryl Lacey, using a similar approach with a slightly different setup from a 52-pound bow. However, at the time of this study, that was still more in the realm of theoretical possibilities and needed much more rigorous documented testing to confirm reliable adequacy.
Okay, important clarification. On a more personal note, the study includes the author's subjective impressions of actually shooting those heavier 724 grain arrows from the 54-pound longbow. What did it feel like?
Well, at 13.4 grains of arrow weight for every pound of draw force, GPP, which is quite heavy by modern standards, but not uncommon in traditional archery, he described it as feeling very smooth and point-and-shoot accurate out to 20 yards. He only needed to hold slightly higher, maybe gap a bit more, at 25 yards.
So the trajectory wasn't completely unusable at typical hunting ranges?
Not for him, apparently. He also noted significantly that the shot was noticeably quieter with those heavier arrows compared to lighter ones.
Which makes sense. More of the bow's energy is being transferred efficiently into moving the arrow, and less is being wasted as vibration and noise.
Exactly. And for the author's own personal hunting style, where he mentioned his average kill distance over many years was under 16 yards due to his stalking methods, a setup like that wouldn't really put him at a significant disadvantage in the field in terms of trajectory.
The comments section of the study really brings the overall purpose and context of all this research into focus. It's worth touching on that.
Absolutely. It's crucial context. Ashby reiterates that the study is not about advocating for everyone to go out and hunt huge game with light draw-weight bows. That wasn't the point at all.
So what was the point of using the 54-pound bow?
Instead, the purpose was to use near minimum force levels, a bow weight that was clearly marginal for the test animal to more effectively isolate, evaluate, and quantify how different arrow design choices impact terminal performance. When forces are lower, the differences in efficiency become much more apparent.
Like stress testing the arrow designs.
Exactly. The goal is to figure out when a setup might be borderline adequate, or frankly inadequate, and more importantly, to identify the specific factors that bow hunters can control, things like FOC, broadhead choice, arrow weight, structural integrity, that will reliably improve their arrow's performance when it reaches the target.
It's a good reminder, too, that a really well-designed, optimized arrow shot from an, let's say, inferior or less powerful bow can often outperform a poorly thought-out, non-optimized arrow shot from a much stronger, superior bow. The arrow matters immensely.
Immensely. Of course, the ideal scenario, as Ashby states, is always to pair the heaviest draw weight that you can shoot accurately and consistently with the absolute best possible arrow setup you can achieve through careful component selection and tuning. Maximize both sides if you can.
So the study's ultimate aim isn't to set minimums, but to define what different arrow design features are capable of.
Precisely. It's about giving bow hunters a better understanding of those capabilities so they can make more informed decisions about their own equipment choices and critically have a more realistic expectation of what's likely to happen when they take a shot under various circumstances.
Knowing how well your arrow is likely to penetrate, and maybe even how it might react if it hits bone or takes a slightly off angle, can give you more confidence and help you make better, more ethical shot selection choices in the field.
Right. Understanding things like penetration potential and even potential skip angles, which Ashby discusses elsewhere, allows for maybe a little more leeway in shot selection sometimes, or helps you better compensate if a shot isn't perfectly broadside or hits slightly back.
The core message seems to be, shoot the heaviest draw weight you can comfortably and accurately handle, combine it with the absolute best, most penetration-focused arrow setup you can build and tune, and then only take shots that are well within your personal zone of certainty.
That's the recipe for success. Because while we all strive for perfect shots every time, we know that sometimes bad hits happen. And in those moments, having a setup that offers a bit more overkill capacity in terms of penetration can sometimes make the critical difference between recovery and loss.
It reminds me of that quote attributed to Nathan Bedford Forrest.
Ah, yes, about getting there firstest with the mostest. Bring enough gun, or in this case, enough arrow performance, to the fight.
Exactly. So, to boil it down, the key findings are that extreme FOC provides a truly significant penetration boost, especially when combined with other factors, allowing optimized arrows from lighter draw weight bows to potentially equal or even exceed the performance of common arrows from much heavier bows.
That's the crux of it. Finally, the study includes an important addendum that talks about the value and validity of outcome-based research, which is the methodology Ashby used for this entire arrow lethality study project.
Yeah, why did he feel the need to include that? Was the method being questioned?
Well, sometimes people misunderstand or are skeptical of research that isn't done in a perfectly controlled laboratory setting. Ashby wanted to clarify why looking at real-world outcomes is actually a very powerful and reliable way to understand complex events, especially in fields like terminal ballistics, where there are so many unpredictable variables involved when an arrow hits living tissue.
So what's the argument for outcome studies?
The argument is that in situations with many random variables, looking at a large number of real-world results, the outcomes actually gives you the most reliable indicators of what's likely to happen in similar future situations. It's about observing patterns in the chaos, essentially.
As opposed to a lab test.
Right. Lab-based studies are valuable, but they operate under highly controlled conditions that often don't fully replicate the incredible variability found in the real world. Different tissue densities, angles, animal movements, bone thicknesses, etc.
He uses an analogy about tuning arrows, right?
Yes, it's a really good one. You can use a machine in a lab to get a precise theoretical spine reading for your arrow shaft. But to really fine-tune that arrow for your bow and your specific shooting form, you have to actually go out and shoot it, observe the outcome, how it flies, and make adjustments based on that real-world performance. You tune based on the outcome.
Okay, I get that.
Outcome research in this context is similar. It looks at the real-world performance penetration depth, bone breakage, wound channels, recovery rates, to figure out which controllable factors consistently lead to the desired outcome, even amidst all the random variables.
And this approach is used elsewhere.
Oh, absolutely. It's the same fundamental approach used in things like consumer reports testing products under real-world use conditions, or in forensic investigations reconstructing events based on the physical evidence outcome, or in medical studies looking at the effectiveness of treatments across large patient populations. He mentions influential researchers like Dr. Frank Chamberlain and the Marshall and Sinow handgun stopping power studies as examples of outcome-based research in terminal ballistics.
And the arrow lethality study itself evolved over time.
Yes, it started by analyzing data from actual hunted animals, then moved towards more controlled shots on freshly downed animals, like the buffalo tests, to get more consistent data, while still maintaining a large database of actual kill results from hunters contributing data. It's a robust framework.
And the key is transparency.
Yes. Ashby emphasizes that the study results are always presented with specific details about the equipment used, the conditions, and the outcomes, allowing others to scrutinize the data, replicate the tests if they wish, and challenge the findings based on their own documented data, not just subjective opinions or anecdotes. He encourages others to conduct and share their own rigorous, documented research.
So the bottom line is that outcome research isn't just guessing. It's a valid scientific method.
Absolutely. It's a scientifically valid and academically recognized method for understanding complex, real-world events. Outcome testing shows us what can happen, what's likely to happen, approximately how often it happens, and critically, how the factors we can control influence those outcomes in realistic scenarios.
Okay, that's a good explanation. So as we come to the end of this deep dive into Dr. Ashby's 2007 study, Part 4, what are the absolute most important things for you, our listener, to take away from all this?
Well, the big headline has to be the powerful, almost dramatic impact that having an extreme front-of-center balance in your arrows can have on penetration. The study clearly shows it can significantly boost your penetration, especially when you combine it with other smart choices in your setup.
Right. And we also saw how important those other factors are, things like choosing a broadhead with a good mechanical advantage, understanding the consistent benefits that single-bevel broadhead designs offer, particularly when hitting bone.
And we can't forget how absolutely crucial it is to have an arrow system that is structurally sound, from broadhead to nock, to withstand the impact and keep driving forward. Arrow integrity is non-negotiable.
And maybe the most encouraging part for some listeners. For those of you who prefer or need to shoot lighter draw weight bows, this study offers some really compelling evidence. With a perfectly tuned arrow that has that extreme FOC and incorporates these other penetration-enhancing features, you might be able to achieve penetration performance that's comparable to, or perhaps even better than, what you'd see from significantly heavier bows using more traditional, less optimized arrow setups.
It really empowers hunters using lighter tackle to maximize their effectiveness. So we really encourage you to think about your own bow hunting setup in light of what we've discussed today. Are there any areas where you could potentially improve your arrow penetration by focusing on things like your arrow's front of center balance, the specific design of your broadheads, or the overall structural integrity and tuning of your arrows? This study has given us a lot of valuable data points to consider.
And remember, this deep dive has really only scratched the surface of what's contained in Dr. Ashby's full study report, which is incredibly detailed, filled with charts, data, and even more insights. If you're really looking to understand the science of arrow penetration and terminal performance, we highly recommend seeking out his work. The Ashby Bowhunting Foundation website is a great resource, and diving in deeper yourself.
It's well worth the read. And finally, let's leave you with this thought to chew on. In a world where archery marketing often gets caught up in the pursuit of speed and kinetic energy numbers, maybe it's time we, as ethical hunters, put more focus back on the fundamental factors that truly lead to consistent, reliable, and humane kills, factors like sufficient momentum, broadhead efficiency, structural integrity, and really smart arrow design, including FOC.
Making informed choices about your setup based on data like this can make all the difference in your success and in ensuring the ethical harvest of the animals we pursue. Food for thought.